Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. Right, so it's still December time, we're still going ahead with our ranking series, and there is a small change that I did. Today I was supposed to release my new tier list, however it will require a bit more work and I just physically couldn't get all of it done because I finally did decide on how I want to get working on it. So I do hope that you guys will enjoy it, but you guys will have to wait a teeny tiny bit longer and soon it will all be clear. So instead of the tier list today, we are gonna be taking a look at top 10 Battlegrounds defenders, and this is going to be a list of defenders basically so far. Also, the list will completely exclude any and all offensive capabilities of the champions, which means that if a champion that is also a capable attacker does have enough potent abilities for defense, they can still make this list. Just like in offensive top 10 list, we will basically be ignoring anything to do with how well these champions do on defense. In this list, we are completely ignoring how well these champions do offensively. We are just going to be effectively looking at what are, in my opinion, so far have been top 10 most useful, hard, tricky defenders. And obviously that has always a lot to do with whatever metas we are playing in. There are specific metas that all of a sudden make specific champions, all but unkillable or much harder to counter. Like we had Crit Me With Your Best Shot, where all of a sudden Captain Britain and Mr. Sinister were like, at the top of the top list. And in the last Kinetic Transference and that root meta, we had Weapon X becoming significantly stronger defenders, so on and so forth. But ultimately, I will be trying to do my best to kind of condense all of the nodes that we have seen in Battlegrounds thus far, and then basically select which champions I personally think have been performing the best on defense. And there are plenty of champions that are extremely hard to fight against. There are plenty of tricky fights that obviously I'm not going to be placing on this list because I only have 10 spots. And at the same time, no matter which champions I place on this list, I know that there will be some very intelligent people immediately running to comment section is like, this champion is not hard, just take a Human Torch and nuke it down. Oh, this champion's not hard either, just take an Archangel and just nuke it down. Takes 50 seconds, easy win. And that is not the point. Obviously, every single champion in this game has a counter. There has not been a single champion introduced in this game that's like virtually unkillable. Right? Obviously, what matters here is typically, how many counters there are, because there are champions that you can go up against with virtually anybody and defeat them. Like you can take any random champion, I don't know, take a Jubilee for all I care. As long as you don't get hit, you're fine. You can defeat that champion with anybody. But then there are champions who require specific counters. So that is kind of like the first thing there. And the second thing is, even with a great counter, some champions obviously pose significantly bigger danger and significantly bigger threat. Also, it is worth pointing out that this list will be created for people, for Battlegrounds, who most of the time do not run Liquid Courage Double Edge Masteries, because then there are, certain things different. Some champions are going up in their value because they handle recoil on defense much better than others, and there are a handful of champions who actually become better defenders with recoil. But in general, this is going to be themed without recoil masteries in mind. All that being said, as always, this is my personal opinion. You are perfectly free to have your own. I do not intend to insult your family's honor by not necessarily valuing every champion defensively the same as you do, and you shouldn't feel bad about it. We all have our own game preferences, our strong sides. We each, do better fighting certain champions and worse some other champions, and I cannot possibly escape, a degree of subjectivity in these rankings, without a doubt. All that being said, let's jump to the game, and I'll try to make these a bit quicker because we are only going through 10 champions, and obviously there are more things unknown. For instance, Attuma has a potential of being a great defender, in my opinion, and in general, there are champions that are freshly released to the contest, and for a while they enjoy this benefit of people being uncertain how to handle them. On defense, for instance, at the moment, I believe one of the most banned defensive champions is Spot. Do I think Spot is going to end up being one of the best defenders half a year down the line? No. I do think that, he has defensive capabilities. We do have some animations that we do need to learn and a whole bunch of other things. But eventually, when we're going to get down to it, I think he's going to be handled just fine. At the same point, right now, if we had a Battlegrounds match and if I saw somebody with a Spot in their account, I would immediately ban it because I am not entirely sure how to tackle that champion. So, in every single meta, there will be those champions that are freshly new released that, people don't know how to fight yet, and they automatically go pretty much to the top of the defensive capability list if those champions do have some defensive abilities. Obviously, if Kabam releases a champion that's, purely offensive, then there's not much of an issue. But that is a very important point to distinguish. So whenever you do get a new champion, if they do have some defensive abilities, it's probably worth putting them in your deck because most people will just be unsure how to deal with those champions, especially which matchups work and so on and so forth. That put aside, and the rest of the disclaimers put aside, overall, which champions have been the most successful on defense? And at spot number 10, I'm going to start with Penny Parker because Penny Parker obviously would have been up a lot higher if this list was made about 6 months ago. In that period, we have had Gore, Hulkling, and Gallon introduced, and people have gotten much more capable with dealing her in general, and there are just many more counters. But it is basically undeniable that this is a champion that does require a fairly specific counter, and in quite a few of these cases, even if you do have specialized counter, there will be certain kind of like fight duration expectation. It's still a relatively high complexity of the fight where you do need to, play well and mistakes happen. So there is still fairly large margin for error when fighting Penny Parkers. And her best and kind of like biggest saving grace is that there are plenty of nodes that do make her counter. So far we have seen, for instance, Penny Parker on Explosive Personality node, where, how are you supposed to get her block down, her shield down, if you can't hit her block more than 4 times before exploding? That immediately, started to present a certain amount of increased difficulty. She also had increased level of difficulty in the root kinetic transference meta, because if you do push her at level 2, she basically infinitely starts looping those level 2s. So plenty of counters that otherwise would have worked have immediately becoming, significantly harder and more stressful to execute in that fight. So ultimately, I do think that despite Kabam having released quite a few incredibly powerful counters to her, overall, I would still put her as one of the 10 most dangerous champions on defense in Battlegrounds. Obviously, she does have offensive capability as well, but we are completely ignoring all of that stuff. And so far, I still put her in the top 10, largely due to how well she had synergized with some specific nodes that significantly reduced the amount of counters and increased the difficulty of the fights themselves. So I do think that Penny Parker is quite a worthwhile addition to one of the top most dangerous defensive options. Again, she's nowhere near as dangerous as she was, when she came out. Within first 3 or so months, she would definitely be at top of this list. At the moment, I do still, however, place her at the top 10. Moving on, spot number 9, I am going to give Mephisto. Because Mephisto is one of those champions where obviously we do have Human Torch, and if you do have Human Torch, he's completely useless and he's gonna die, within seconds. But then, Human Torch put aside, he's one of those champions that in most cases force the fight to slow down, even if you have a good counter, and that immediately has a ton of value. Even if you are using suitable champions against this guy, he's capable of making that fight uncomfortable, pending how his AI is, because how RNG triggers his auras, that gives him extra power gain. Obviously, typically, in most cases, when you dodge his level 1, you end up triggering that dex, and that gives him Mystic Dispersion. So there's quite a lot of power gaining going on in this entire fight as a whole. He does have that indestructible period, which often does extend the fight. It's not necessarily that he heals for a ton of damage, because obviously his healing ability does not scale with the modified health, but it's more so that when you drop like a massive level 2, you know he's not gonna die from it, and then there's gonna be some period of time where he's also, you know, indestructible and healing slightly, which still prolongs that fight. And ultimately also the fact that unless you are Incinerate immune, you are likely going to take at the very least some amount of damage fighting this guy, which in the game mode like Battlegrounds is extremely crucial. Mephisto was one of the earlier defenders that I did rank up for Alliance War defense and Battlegrounds defense, and I can wholeheartedly say that he has done his job extremely well. He has been one of my most banned defenders, like, period. And obviously, as long as there isn't Torch around, there typically isn't that large amount of champions that does great against him. There is Scorpion now that's getting more and more popular that can do fantastic, but even, you know, the newer champions, for instance, Quicksilver is just not a great option against him. Then we have champions, you know, Spider-Ham will do well enough, but he still can take some Incinerate damage. We do have like champions like Titania and a handful of other science champions that whereas they would work against majority of the Mystic champions, they can still handle the Mephisto fight, but there is still that, you know, Incinerate damage that often resonates in score and lets you kind of squeak out your victories. And obviously, if opponent does not have an appropriate counter to Mephisto, then the fight can go sideways extremely quickly. So ultimately speaking, I do think that Mephisto deserves a spot number 9 here, because he combines the needing of a specific counter for him, which also often involves immunity or like specific type of playstyle, with also, you know, increased power gain, quite high level of difficulty in the fight, and where even if you do everything correctly, the fight can still end up going sideways, depending on the AI. So I do think that in vast majority of the cases, there's always inherent danger when you go up against this guy. And I placed him at number 9. Number 8, I'm going to give it to Ebony Maw. Now, there are people who have this guy down to a T and can deal with him basically exceptionally well, in which case he is not particularly great. But he is one of those champions that does not necessarily gain his value from being able to stretch out the fights, because he's not the tankiest guy. He's fairly squishy. But he does often propose quite high degree of difficulty in the fight, where if you do make a mistake, that will cost you a lot. Like, if you do attack him when you're not meant to and you falter, that's immediate degen on you and you lose like 15-20% health. If he does, you know, get to throw 2 level 1s in quick enough succession, which he often does, that's a degen on you in most cases. And then, God forbid, if you, you know, make a mistake baiting out his level 2, that's basically an instant KO. So Ebony Maw is one of those champions who might not necessarily always be great at extending fights, and if opponent, you know, gets a great fight going against Ebony Maw, they might be able to dispatch of him quite quickly. But he's definitely a champion that, number 1, requires a fairly specific counter. Number 2, even with many of the more decent options, there is a relatively high degree of that fight, you know, not going perfect, and there being, you know, fairly decent amount of chip damage, or there being some degen damage, let alone a full-on KO. So Ebony Maw is quite a dangerous defender, and I do think that his, obviously, value cannot be understated. And again, he's one of those champions that often can synergize extremely well with specific nodes. He was, in case of, you know, crit me with your best shot, for instance, one of the more dangerous defenders, where if opponent doesn't have a science champion, then, you know, the fight becomes very hard against him. And then even recently as well, with root and kinetic transference, when he does have the ability to gain some extra power, he can be quite dangerous guy. And then also in past, I remember when we had the buffet node or power snack node, you know, that can also be triggering the degen. Obviously, again, just like with any champion, there are plenty of counters, but I do consider him to be one of the more dangerous defenders. Right, let's move on to spot number 7, and that's just a tank. Battlegrounds definitely have given quite a lot of emphasis to Mystic class in general, and also, more specifically speaking, the tanks of Mystic class. And Sasquatch is one of the 3 best Mystic tank defenders. There's no question about it. And on top of that, Sasquatch is gifted with additional damage mitigation abilities, obviously, as he's building his rage charge. The one kind of like roulette aspect that I'm personally not the biggest fan of, but it also, you know, can work equally at your favor and your disadvantage, is that you do not have real control when he enters Wrath of Tenrak, which obviously has hindered him offensively, which we again are not taking in consideration here, but it also can make him significantly more potent as a defender or significantly worse. So let me explain that. If Sasquatch enters his Wrath of Tenrak early, he's not the greatest defender, because yes, he does have quite big health pool, but you typically don't have problem awaiting his level 1, level 2, and if he enters Wrath of Tenrak early, it doesn't last that long, you most likely will not get cornered, you can just, you know, wait it out or deal some damage meanwhile, and then it's going to end quickly, and his damage mitigation mechanic, you know, is not really going to come into play to a big degree. However, if he keeps building up his rage and he doesn't enter Wrath of Tenrak, then the damage mitigation ability combined with his massive health pool, his regen at the end, and then massive duration of his Wrath of Tenrak makes him one of the most scary and dangerous defenders ever. So how dangerous on defense he is quite literally depends whether he enters Wrath of Tenrak with 5, 6 charges or he gets up to 8, 10, 12 charges. But ultimately, due to his massive health pool, him being a Mystic defender, being able to benefit from Mystic Dispersion, in most metas he does work as a very potent defensive option that always has to be respected. Again, the reason why I am ranking him behind most of, well, couple other Mystic tanks is largely the fact that he is not safe from Archangel, Human Torch, or majority of the other nukes. He doesn't have as many kind of like defensive tools aside from extra damage mitigation, but he's still 100% worth having ranked up for Battlegrounds on defense as a great stall option. He's also one of those champions where even if opponent has Human Torch, you know, pending the RNG and pending the AI, you can potentially stall opponent long enough with their Human Torch for you to be able to, you know, outspeed them or outscore them. Again, largely due to the fact that he has top 3 biggest health pool in the game, as well as extra damage mitigation abilities. So ultimately, I do like Sasquatch a lot as a defender. Spot number 5, I'm going to be giving into Nick Fury. And the Nick Fury thing, again, it largely depends on meta. Like, I do think that in previous meta with Kinetic Transference and Root, he was one of the top 3 defenders, I would say, because he became significantly more and more difficult. And obviously, the biggest party trick with Nick Fury lies in the fact that he basically has 2 health bars. Thus, with that, you know, the fight is always going to last longer against an equal opponent who doesn't have, quote-unquote, the second life. But that's obviously not it, because making a mistake against Nick Fury can be extremely punishing. The fact that he goes periodically unblockable can be quite dangerous. His level 1 is quite hard to evade, so often opens you up to some chip damage. The fact that he's stun immune in his second phase also opens people up to chip damage. And ultimately, he's one of those champions that will almost always give you an expectation of a certain duration in a fight. Like, there are a lot of champions you can use against Nick Fury, so from that point of view, he's not necessarily the best champion, you know, because virtually everything that's good in Battlegrounds can potentially be used to fight against Nick Fury, but at the same time, he does demand the highest of high damage outputs from your opponent for them to have a real chance of beating you, due to the, again, the increased health pool and his kind of like stalling capabilities. And then obviously there is some inherent amount of danger in fighting Nick Fury always. When you make a mistake, or when you miscount the charges, when he goes unblockable, or when he throws his level 1 that randomly becomes unblockable. So there's quite a lot to know and take in consideration. Obviously, as more and more seasons go by, people get better at fighting Nick Fury. That has been quite big impact here as well. But at the same time, no matter how well you play, you know, there is that second health bar thing that kind of will always be there to work in his favor. Obviously, we do have champions like Toad and Penny Parker that are capable of basically bypassing that second health bar, but neither one of those champions I would describe as the pinnacle of damage output in the game in general, or the fastest killers necessarily. So ultimately, I do think that Nick Fury deserves his spot as the 6th best defender, and yeah, he has been a functionally, great addition to virtually every deck in every single meta thus far. Spot number 5, I'm going to put in Thing, and again, obviously, I'm just going to take my Hitmonkey or Falcon. Yes, Thing has counters, like anything else in the game. But with Thing, there are quite few certain conditions that often make him much tougher defender than he normally is. And on his base, again, he's one of those champions that's very good at stretching out the fight, that's very good also at, increasing the potential risk within the fight, an opponent making a mistake. And the reason why I'm placing him as high is, again, of how well he synergizes with specific different nodes. For instance, if you do need to go up against Thing in the next season, when we're going to have Power Shield, you're going to need a very, very specific champion in order to be able to deal with the Thing. Because if you're going to be doing 400% of your special attack damage, virtually any special attack in that case is going to be triggering his protection, de facto. So that means you're going to have a champion that can somehow ignore his protection and deliver damage during special attacks at a quick manner. So automatically Thing becomes like one of the kind of like harder defenders to deal with. And there have been plenty of nodes of similar nature where his protection can completely hinder your ability to take him down quickly. Additionally, on top of that, I absolutely love the fact that Thing is not necessarily the greatest matchup for Human Torch or Archangel or CGR or, most of the other traditionally, most popular nuke champions. Yes, there are the skill champions like Hitmonkey that can do him very quickly, and Falcon, but, they're not necessarily ever present, and every champion, again, has some counters. And then we do have the skill staples like Mole Man or Kingpin or Shang-Chi that, for instance, can do this fine, but even they will take a considerate amount of time in order to get him down. So I do find Thing to be one of those champions that's always extremely handy and helpful to keep in your back pocket. If you get him to SIG 200, he can be quite literally, an unstoppable timeout machine in many cases. So yeah, Thing gets spot number 5. Spot number 4 is going to go to Man-Thing, and there is a very good reason why I value Man-Thing as highly as a defender for Battlegrounds as I do, and that is the fact that he escapes majority of the mystic quote-unquote weaknesses that a lot of champions have. Because number one condition that really does help Man-Thing function better as a defender is also the fact that as you are going to be fighting Man-Thing, I need a way to address the poison. Now, obviously, you can be poison immune, you can be nullify immune, you can have access to neutralize, or there can be some other abilities. But generically speaking, there is that poison that needs to be taken in consideration. That immediately narrows down a list of potential counters. Then on top of all of that, it just so happens that most of the poison immune champions are typically cosmic or typically tech, who are not necessarily the greatest or fastest options against champion like Man-Thing. So that again limits kind of further the amount of champions that will be able to deal with him quickly. And then obviously the fact that he's great at stalling time. If awakened, there is plenty of regeneration capabilities as well, and you get pustules and those get nullified. He does have a massive base health pool as well. I believe he has one of the 5 biggest HPs in game, so he's great at stalling time like that. But there is also additional bit that has come into play quite often, and a lot of people do completely forget about it. And here you go. Man-Thing is made of swamp mush and lacks any meaningful weak points to exploit. This makes it immune to armor break or shatter effects and prevents critical hits from dealing bonus damage. And obviously in this game, critical hits are a major part of the game. So that means we are giving the champion that has one of the biggest health pools in a game effectively a very significant damage reduction mechanic against a lot of the top tier damage options. And then obviously the armor break immunity is quite nice in certain matchups and so on and so forth. So ultimately, Man-Thing is just very good in most of the metas as a defender to stall people out. In some metas better than others, like crit me with your best shot. I do like the fact that he's bleed immune, therefore he can't be Archangeled. Also, you can take Human Torch up against him, but there is a good chance that Human Torch will lose, you know, some meaningful amount of health, pending on RNG here and how well opponent plays that match out and what AI you have. So Human Torch is not necessarily a safe option against Man-Thing as well. And things like that give these champions extra value on defense. So I do think that overall Man-Thing is, at the moment, so far has been about the 4th best defender in general. And he's great at, you know, wasting time. There are hardly any champions that can get him down, let's say, sub 50 or sub 40 seconds. Definitely sub 40 seconds. I don't think I have seen many fights like that. But ultimately, yes, Man-Thing is great, and you should respect this guy for Battlegrounds defense 1000%. Moving on, spot number 3, and spot number 3 I'm placing Rintrah. And why Rintrah is as high is many reasons similar to Man-Thing, but in his case, obviously, they are expressed slightly differently. In Rintrah's case, you do get the neutralize on you basically at all times, which means that any champion that relies on any type of buffs at all whatsoever is immediately useless. And you're gonna say, yeah, but you know, most cases you're gonna use like a science character or somebody that doesn't have many buffs. But then if that Rintrah is awakened, you will still likely gonna be forced to trigger dexterity quite a few times against Rintrah, which obviously will still trigger the power gain that he has. And he has a great time stalling mechanic built in his kit that most people don't really realize, and that is the fact that his special animations just seem to last forever. Like if you take a look side-by-side comparison, how quick is Captain Marvel's special attack, or you know, an average champion special attack, and then you see Rintrah take his time sharpening his horns or conjuring those swords. And my thing whenever I fight against Rintrah is I always get extremely annoyed by how long those special animations take. But in a game mode like Battlegrounds, that is extremely important, because those are additional seconds that you can't do anything to him, right? And again, obviously we do still have the massive health pool, one of the 3 biggest health pools in the game, if I'm not mistaken. On top of that, he does require you to often interrupt your ideal damage rotation. So many champions, even like Scorpion, for instance, or a bunch of other science champions, are not necessarily the easiest to be used against this guy, because you need to knock him down consistently and persistently in order not to start getting ruptures placed on you and him going stun immune and him going unstoppable. And quite often in a scenario like Battlegrounds, you end up rushing because you do want to finish as fast as possible. And against Rintrah, that is about as punishing as it can get, because if you do miscount how many hits your special attack has, for instance, and if you drop your special attack and he gets to pass 10 charges while he's in the corner, then he goes unstoppable and then he just smacks you in the face. So there are quite a lot of things happening when fighting Rintrah pretty much at all times. There's always the his mystical charges that you need to keep an eye on. There's always the neutralize that you need to be aware of. And there's obviously his power levels, and then combine that with increased 30% energy resistance, 20% crit resistance, again significantly reducing damage output of many champions. And yeah, he is one of those guys that just makes a lot of people trip up. And even if you do, and the reason why he's up as high is typically, even if you do have a good counter against him, the fights will take some time. He will, you know, stall them out for, you know, a considerable amount of time. So that, again, holds a significant amount of value in Battlegrounds, because your mission is always, obviously, to be faster than your opponent and finish with high health, ideally. Spot number 2. Spot number 2 is going to Korg. And Korg enjoys the luxury of being the defender that has the least amount hard counters that can do him extremely quickly. I don't think there is anything in the game that does him like under 40 seconds. Like any of these previous champions, can be torched or archangeled or CGR'd or something relatively quickly, or like Falcon thing. With Korg, there's pretty much nothing that does nuke him that fast. Obviously, again, it will depend on meta and many of the other things. There is a fairly decent, good base difficulty level fighting Korg. Like you do need to be able to evade his level 1, otherwise you're going to mask quite a lot of chip damage. Then you need to be ready of him shrugging off your parry stunts while he has rock stacks active in most cases, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the best thing about Korg is that in every meta, there aren't many champions that can get rid of him like super quickly. Like even if opponent has one of the or the better counters against Korg, which it can be, CGR or Dr. Doom or Human Torch or Bishop or something, all of those champions, will likely take, 40 plus seconds, including CGR in most cases. And that is a very solid time that you can virtually, give you a go to fight against somebody else. And that is assuming that opponents are not going to be taking a ton of chip damage. Now, there are getting more and more extremely stupidly skilled players that are getting more and more comfortable with like light intercept and fighting Korgs in general. But, that is going to be happening with virtually every character. Ultimately, against, all of that, it's just a natural part of a champion being as big of a problem. But he is a problem. Also, the fact that he does have the bleed and shock immunity, ability to shrug off debuffs, makes him, significantly harder to fight against. Ability to go unstoppable when you do evade him too much can be extremely annoying, especially in this last root meta. It was a very big problem. And then everything else, because he does have increased crit resistance, more and more and more. So ultimately, I do think Korg is kind of like one of those champions that we see every meta on defense, and every meta on defense, he's a problem. He definitely has lost me plenty of matches, as in like I have gotten smacked by this guy around plenty of times, and I have won plenty of matches because of Korg as well. So I do think that ultimately the fact that he works with virtually any mastery setup in any meta as a stable defender gives him his second place spot. And I don't think there are too many people that are going to disagree with me on this. I mean, I'm sure that there's always going to be somebody, but I think Korg has more than proved himself as a defender that, deserves this placement. But what's better than that? What is better than that? Well, as I said with Korg, there is a limited amount of like great counters that will be able to do him quickly. And the next champion basically is the same. There is very limited amount of champions that are able to get through this fight very quickly. But on top of that, there is a huge amount of guaranteed damage coming out of this champion at a high sig if you do not have one of those few counters. So I do think Domino absolutely has proven herself as the best Battlegrounds defender thus far. There is a very good reason why in the MCOC Open Heavy Zone tournament, virtually every round started with dominoes being placed on defense and, people mirror matching out like that. Because obviously, yes, I'll just Nimrod her and stuff like that. Yeah, obviously there's Nimrod, there's Guardian, there's Meg Sentinel, but that's about it in most cases. Obviously you can use Ultron or Warlock, but in many of the metas, if you bring in like Warlock against Domino, you're still going to lose half of your health on equal rank Domino with max sig. And then obviously there are certain nodes that make her more powerful as a defender that she can synergize with. For instance, increasing her evade capabilities, or again with Root, where you cannot dex if you're unlucky, for instance, makes her even more unbearable in defense. And there have been a ton of nodes that make Domino even more unbearable. And in the last meta, for instance, Omega Sentinel was just not a great champion for that meta because she largely relies on throwing level 2s and then maintaining the fight rhythm with the heavy attacks and everything else. And it was extremely hard to use Omega Sentinel to a point where she didn't even really function well enough as a counter. Opponents often got KO'd or sometimes timed out against Domino with Omega Sentinel in the last meta. And that just meant get rid of Nimrod, and opponents kind of screwed if they see a Domino. And with the increased access of signature stones, we see more and more Dominos being ranked up and sigged up. And I can understand absolutely why. She's one of those champions where if you do not have a counter and an opponent drops her late, you just lose a round. That's it. You know, there's not much else you can do. You can take your best attacker, try and nuke her down as quickly as possible, but unless opponent really screws up, you're just going to lose that round. Because she's quite finicky and hard to fight against. Your abilities will constantly fail. You take a crap ton of damage for doing nothing. And that's it. I do think Domino is so far proving herself as the best defender in the game. And mainly because there's a very limited amount of champions that are actually immune to her crit fail damage. So, that is the list, in my opinion, about the Battlegrounds defenders. Let me know what you guys think about this. I will place a list here. So we start with Penny Parker, Mephisto, Ebony Maw Sasquatch, Nick Thing, Man Thing, Rintrah, Korg, Domino. And yes, Mystics do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 champions. So half of top 10 best Battlegrounds defenders have been Mystics. But again, keep in mind one important thing before I go away though. I do not necessarily recommend putting all of these champions in your deck at any given time. It depends on meta. Sometimes you might end up having all 10 of them in there. But just like I don't recommend having any, 10 exclusive attackers in your deck, I also do not recommend having 10 specific defenders in your deck in general. I do still heavily advocate for having an extremely well-balanced deck where vast majority of your champions have dual purpose, both offensive and defensive capability, and then you just need to kind of quickly select in between the best of the best offensive champions and the best of the best defensive champions. Obviously here, plenty of these champions would qualify as offensively and defensively capable in most metas, like Rintrah and Domino and Maw and Penny Parker and stuff like that. But again, it is just something to keep in mind. Do not think you will make a good deck if you just throw in a ton of defenders and a ton of attackers. There's much more to that, and there has to be a balance, like with all things. Anyways, that is it for now. And tomorrow, I will be uploading top 10 best BG attacker videos. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you guys later. See ya. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about